The morning fog clung to the Karelian forests like a burial shroud, October 3rd, 1941, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing. Senior Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev pressed his cheek against the wooden stock of his Mosin Nagant rifle, the metal so cold it burned through his threadbare gloves. 43 confirmed kills. The number sat in his logbook like a death sentence written in reverse, each one representing a moment where he'd been still enough, patient enough, or clever enough to send a German soldier home in a wooden box. But numbers don't keep you alive when you're lying in a shell crater for 16 hours waiting for a single shot. And they don't explain why some snipers survive while others get their heads blown off before they fire their first round. Around him, the ruins of Stalingrad stretched in every direction, a city transformed into a graveyard where every window was a firing position and every pile of rubble concealed someone trying to kill you. The Soviet 62nd Army was dying here, bleeding out in a defensive battle that military theorists would study for the next century. But theory didn't matter when you were counting ammunition and watching German soldiers advance through streets your comrades had died defending. Zaitsev had been in Stalingrad for 3 weeks, long enough to understand that traditional infantry tactics were suicide in this environment, long enough to realize that specialized skills could make the difference between holding a position and watching it fall. The Red Army's sniper program had been hastily expanded after the initial German invasion revealed catastrophic deficiencies in Soviet marksmanship. While German soldiers routinely engaged targets at 300 to 400 meters, Soviet infantry struggled beyond 150. The gap wasn't just training, it was doctrine, equipment, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern warfare actually worked when two armies collided. Zaitsev had grown up hunting in the Ural Mountains, shooting rabbits and deer with his grandfather's rifle before he was tall enough to carry it properly. That childhood experience gave him instincts most Soviet soldiers lacked. He understood wind drift, bullet drop, the way temperature affected powder burn rates. More importantly, he understood patience, the ability to wait motionless for hours while targets moved through your field of fire, selecting the perfect moment to take a shot that wouldn't give away your position. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Stalingrad was teaching Zaitsev something new, something that contradicted everything his grandfather had taught him about marksmanship, something that seemed so counterintuitive, so obviously wrong, that he'd initially dismissed it as the desperate improvisation of soldiers who didn't know better. The technique involved tilting your head at an angle when looking through the scope, not aligning your eye perfectly with the optical axis the way every marksmanship manual insisted. Instead, canting your head slightly to one side, creating an offset between your line of sight and the rifle's bore axis. Every instructor at the sniper school in Moscow would have failed him for even suggesting such a thing. Proper marksmanship demanded perfect alignment, eye centered behind the scope, cheek weld consistent, body position symmetrical. Tilting your head introduced variables that ruined accuracy. Or so the theory claimed, except the theory was written by men who'd never spent a day in Stalingrad, where German snipers were so skilled they could track the glint of sunlight off a scope lens from 800 meters away and put a bullet through your eye socket before you realized you'd been spotted. Zaitsev had watched 3 Soviet snipers die in the first week, all of them killed in the same way. A single shot to the head while looking through their scopes, killed by German marksmen who'd learned to watch for that distinctive silhouette. A sniper's head perfectly aligned behind their optics, motionless, focused, completely predictable. The Germans had turned Soviet marksmanship doctrine into a death sentence. They knew exactly what a proper shooting position looked like. They knew where the Soviet sniper's head would be. And they knew that a soldier looking through a scope had exactly zero peripheral awareness of threats from other angles. The head tilt technique had emerged organically among Soviet snipers who survived long enough to recognize the pattern. Tilt your head slightly when acquiring targets. Don't present the symmetrical profile German snipers expected. Break up the silhouette that their training had taught them to identify. It sounded insane. It violated fundamental marksmanship principles, but it kept you alive. Zaitsev first attempted the tender technique on October 7th, 1941, during a counter-sniper operation near the Volga riverbank. He'd tracked a German sniper to a position in a destroyed apartment building, roughly 400 meters northwest of his hide. The German was good, professional, patient. He'd already killed 2 Soviet soldiers that morning, both clean headshots that suggested optical precision and excellent range estimation. Standard counter-sniper doctrine called for Zaitsev to establish his firing position, acquire the target through his scope, and wait for the German to expose himself during his next shot. But Zaitsev understood the tactical problem. If he aligned his eye perfectly behind his scope, presenting the ideal marksmanship silhouette, the German would spot him first. Both snipers would be looking for the same visual signature. Both would be hunting the characteristic shape of a head behind optics. Whoever saw the other first would win. Whoever fired first would survive. The odds were essentially even, and Zaitsev didn't gamble with even odds when his life was the stake. So he tilted his head 20 degrees to the left, creating an asymmetric profile that broke up the recognizable silhouette of a sniper in firing position. His line of sight through the scope wasn't perfect. The image was slightly distorted at the edges. His cheek weld was inconsistent with proper technique, but his head was no longer where the German sniper expected it to be. For 3 hours, Zaitsev maintained that position, scanning the German's suspected location through his tilted optics. His neck ached. The awkward angle created muscle tension that proper form would have avoided. Everything about the position felt wrong. Then the German moved. A subtle shift in the rubble, barely visible. The distinctive shape of a helmet edge appeared for perhaps 2 seconds. Zaitsev didn't consciously aim. His body had been preparing for this moment for 3 hours. His finger tightened on the trigger with pressure he'd built up gradually, eliminating any sudden movement that might shift the rifle. The Mosin Nagant roared. The 7.62mm round crossed 400 meters in slightly under half a second. When Zaitsev looked through his scope again, properly aligned this time, the German helmet was gone. In its place, a spreading dark stain on the rubble. 44th confirmed kill. But the significance of that shot went beyond adding another tally to Zaitsev's logbook. He'd survived a counter-sniper engagement by violating marksmanship doctrine. The head tilt technique had broken up his silhouette enough that the German never identified him as a threat. And the German, using perfect form and proper technique, had presented exactly the profile Zaitsev was hunting for. Over the next 2 weeks, Zaitsev refined the technique. He experimented with different tilt angles, testing how much offset he could introduce while maintaining acceptable accuracy. He discovered that 20 to 30 degrees provided the optimal balance. Enough distortion to break up his silhouette, not so much that he couldn't effectively engage targets. He learned to compensate for the optical distortion by adjusting his point of aim slightly. The technique introduced systematic error that could be predicted and corrected. More importantly, he began teaching the method to other Soviet snipers in his unit. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Experienced marksmen who'd spent years perfecting proper form rejected the technique as amateurish. They cited marksmanship theory, optical physics, and the accumulated wisdom of military shooting instructors going back decades. They were correct on every technical point. The head tilt technique did introduce accuracy problems. It did create optical distortion. It did violate fundamental principles of marksmanship. But it also kept snipers alive. And in Stalingrad, survival mattered more than theory. By late October 1941, a clear pattern had emerged. Soviet snipers using proper form were dying at rates that approached 70% within their first month of deployment. Snipers using the head tilt technique were surviving at nearly double that rate. The sample size was small, maybe 30 snipers total, but the correlation was undeniable. German counter-sniper teams were extraordinarily effective at killing Soviet marksmen who presented textbook profiles. They struggled to identify and engage snipers who broke up their silhouettes through unconventional positioning. The German response revealed how deeply the pattern had embedded itself in their doctrine. Wehrmacht sniper training in 1941 emphasized recognition of standard shooting positions. Students learned to identify the characteristic shapes of soldiers in prone, kneeling, and sitting firing positions. They practiced scanning terrain for specific visual signatures, the alignment of head and shoulders, the angle of a rifle's barrel, the circular shadow that scope optics cast in certain lighting conditions. This training was extraordinarily effective against opponents who followed conventional doctrine, but it created cognitive blind spots when confronting snipers who didn't present expected profiles. German snipers in Stalingrad began reporting encounters where Soviet positions appeared empty until they fired, where expected visual signatures didn't materialize even when the general location of an enemy marksman was known. The Wehrmacht's sniper training had optimized for identifying one specific set of patterns. When those patterns changed, their effectiveness degraded significantly. By November 1941, Zaitsev had increased his confirmed kill count to 93. Nearly 50 of those kills came after he'd adopted the head tilt technique. The acceleration wasn't coincidental. The method allowed him to occupy firing positions longer without being compromised. Longer exposure time meant more opportunities to engage targets. More opportunities meant higher kill counts. But the technique's effectiveness extended beyond Zaitsev personally. Other snipers adopting the method reported similar results: increased survival rates, longer time in position, higher kill totals. The data was fragmentary and anecdotal, gathered during a desperate defensive battle where record-keeping was sporadic at best. But the pattern was clear enough that regimental commanders began incorporating head tilt positioning into informal training programs. The Soviet military bureaucracy, never known for rapid adaptation, initially dismissed the technique. The main artillery directorate, responsible for sniper training doctrine, maintained that proper marksmanship fundamentals were non-negotiable. Field reports from Stalingrad were classified as tactical observations rather than doctrine modifications. Official sniper training continued to emphasize perfect alignment, consistent cheek weld, and symmetrical body positioning. The disconnect between official doctrine and battlefield reality created a two-tier system. Veteran snipers in active combat zones used the head tilt technique because it kept them alive. New snipers arriving from training schools used proper form because that's what they'd been taught. The new arrivals died at predictably higher rates until they either adapted or were killed. The technique spread through informal networks rather than official channels revealed how World War II small unit tactics actually evolved. Doctrine changes lagged months or years behind battlefield innovations. Successful techniques propagated through word of mouth, shared between soldiers who'd survived long enough to recognize what worked. By the time official doctrine caught up, if it ever did, combat veterans had already moved on to newer adaptations. Zaitsev became the informal evangelist for head tilt shooting, not through any desire for recognition, but because teaching other snipers kept more Soviet soldiers alive. During brief periods behind the lines, he conducted impromptu training sessions, demonstrating the technique to newly arrived marksmen. His approach was pragmatic rather than theoretical. He didn't explain optical physics or discuss the biomechanics of asymmetric positioning. He simply showed them how to tilt their heads, how to compensate for the distortion, and why the method worked in Stalingrad's specific tactical environment. The training sessions violated protocol. Zaitsev lacked official authority to modify sniper doctrine, but frontline realities superseded bureaucratic hierarchies. Company commanders who wanted their snipers to survive looked the other way when Zaitsev taught methods that contradicted official training. The German army's response to the head tilt technique emerged gradually through the winter of 1941–42. Wehrmacht intelligence officers began collecting reports of Soviet snipers using unconventional positioning. They noted the decreased effectiveness of their counter-sniper teams. They observed that identification time for Soviet marksmen had increased significantly. The German solution was characteristically systematic. They expanded their visual recognition training to include asymmetric profiles and unconventional positions. They taught their snipers to scan for secondary indicators beyond the primary silhouette. They emphasized patient observation rather than rapid target identification. The adaptation was logical, professional, and ultimately insufficient. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Soviet snipers using head-tilt positioning were harder to identify, regardless of how thoroughly German snipers were trained. The technique introduced enough visual ambiguity that it degraded target recognition under all circumstances. German snipers could compensate to some degree, but they couldn't eliminate the advantage entirely. By February 1942, Zaitsev's confirmed kill count had reached 149. His survival through the winter siege of Stalingrad, when most Soviet soldiers simply tried to avoid freezing to death, established him as one of the Red Army's most effective snipers. The head-tilt technique was by then widely adopted among Soviet marksmen on the Stalingrad front. Its effectiveness had been demonstrated through months of continuous combat, yet official doctrine still hadn't acknowledged its existence. The bureaucratic resistance revealed institutional problems that plagued Soviet military adaptation throughout the war. The Red Army could mobilize millions of soldiers, produce enormous quantities of equipment, and sustain massive casualties while continuing operations. But it struggled to incorporate tactical innovations from frontline units into standardized doctrine. The gap between what worked in combat and what was officially approved created persistent inefficiencies. Soldiers survived by ignoring their training and learning from veterans who'd figured out battlefield realities through trial and error. The head-tilt technique represented a specific solution to a specific tactical problem: German counter-sniper effectiveness in urban warfare. But its implications extended beyond Stalingrad. The method demonstrated that unconventional approaches could provide significant advantages, even when they violated established principles. That survival often demanded flexibility rather than adherence to doctrine. That soldiers who adapted to battlefield realities performed better than soldiers who followed their training manuals. These lessons applied across multiple domains of military operations. The Soviet Army eventually learned them, though the learning process cost tens of thousands of lives that might have been saved through faster institutional adaptation. Zaitsev himself never claimed to have invented the head-tilt technique. He acknowledged learning it from other snipers who'd survived long enough to recognize its value. His contribution was systematizing the method, teaching it deliberately rather than letting it spread randomly, and advocating for its adoption even when doing so contradicted official doctrine. That advocacy put him at odds with military bureaucrats who valued standardization and consistency. But it saved lives among the snipers he trained, and that mattered more to Zaitsev than bureaucratic approval. The winter siege of Stalingrad tested every survival technique soldiers had developed. Temperatures dropped to -40°C. Supply lines collapsed. Ammunition became scarce enough that snipers were allocated 5 rounds per day for all engagements. Food rations fell to starvation levels. Frostbite claimed more casualties than German bullets some weeks. In that environment, the head-tilt technique's value extended beyond counter-sniper survival. The method allowed snipers to remain in position longer despite brutal conditions. Conventional prone shooting positions exposed soldiers to ground cold that could kill through hypothermia within hours. The slightly elevated head position required by tilted shooting reduced direct contact with frozen ground. The difference was marginal, maybe an extra 30 minutes before cold penetration became dangerous. But 30 minutes could mean the difference between completing a mission and abandoning a position. Small advantages accumulated into survival. Zaitsev's fieldcraft during this period demonstrated the difference between adequate snipers and exceptional ones. He understood that shooting skill was necessary but insufficient. Fieldcraft, camouflage, position selection, route planning, all these factors determined whether a sniper lived long enough to employ their marksmanship skills. The head-tilt technique was one element in a comprehensive approach to urban sniper operations that Zaitsev had developed through months of continuous combat. He selected positions that offered multiple covered withdrawal routes. He never occupied the same hide 2 days running. He varied his shooting times to avoid establishing predictable patterns. He used decoy positions to draw German counter-sniper fire while observing from offset locations. He coordinated with other Soviet snipers to create overlapping fields of fire that covered each other's positions. Every technique violated some element of official doctrine while improving survival odds and operational effectiveness. By March 1942, the tactical situation in Stalingrad had shifted significantly. Soviet counter-offensives had surrounded the German Sixth Army, cutting their supply lines and beginning the siege that would eventually destroy Friedrich Paulus's forces. The change from defensive to offensive operations altered sniper employment. Rather than defending fixed positions, Soviet marksmen began supporting infantry advances, clearing German positions building by building. The head tilt technique remained relevant in this new tactical context. German snipers covering defensive positions still needed to identify Soviet marksmen before they could engage them. The asymmetric profile created by tilted shooting continued to degrade German target recognition, but offensive operations introduced new challenges. Snipers moving with advancing infantry had less time to establish proper positions. Shots often had to be taken quickly from improvised locations. The careful preparation that enabled effective tilted shooting in defensive operations wasn't always possible during assaults. Zaitsev adapted by teaching rapid position establishment techniques, how to find adequate cover quickly, how to assess fields of fire in unfamiliar terrain, how to take hasty shots from unconventional positions while maintaining enough accuracy to be effective. The head tilt method became one tool among many rather than the primary technique. The flexibility to shift between conventional and unconventional shooting positions based on tactical circumstances became the defining characteristic of Soviet sniper operations in 1942 Stalingrad. By April 1942, when organized German resistance in Stalingrad finally collapsed, Zaitsev had recorded 225 confirmed kills. The number made him one of the most successful snipers in Soviet service. But the statistic concealed as much as it revealed. How many of those kills resulted from the head tilt technique specifically? The records don't distinguish between conventional and unconventional shooting positions. How many Soviet snipers survived because Zaitsev taught them to tilt their heads before looking through their scopes? No official count exists. How much did the technique contribute to Soviet victory in Stalingrad relative to other tactical and strategic factors? The question is unanswerable with available data. What can be established with certainty is that Soviet snipers using the head tilt technique survived at significantly higher rates than those using conventional form. That German counter-sniper effectiveness declined as the technique spread through Soviet units. That Zaitsev's personal kill count accelerated after he adopted the method, and that the innovation emerged from battlefield adaptation rather than institutional planning. These facts suggest the technique provided meaningful tactical advantages in Stalingrad's specific combat environment. Whether those advantages would translate to other theaters, other tactical situations, other wars, remained to be tested. The German army's own sniper doctrine evolved in response to their Stalingrad experience. Wehrmacht training programs began emphasizing unconventional position recognition. They incorporated lessons learned about Soviet sniper tactics into instruction for new marksmen. They developed improved optical equipment designed to reduce the T size, a signature that made snipers identifiable. But these adaptations came too late to affect the Stalingrad outcome. The battle had already been decided by February 1943, when the last German forces surrendered. The tactical innovations that emerged from months of urban combat, including the head tilt shooting technique, had already propagated through Soviet sniper units across the entire Eastern Front. The propagation of the head tilt technique through Soviet sniper schools revealed how military institutions process battlefield innovations when survival data becomes overwhelming. By summer 1943, casualty statistics from Stalingrad had been compiled and analyzed by the main artillery directorate. The numbers told a story that bureaucratic resistance could no longer ignore. Soviet snipers, trained in conventional marksmanship doctrine and deployed to Stalingrad between September 1941 and February 1942, experienced average survival. times of 3.2 weeks. Snipers documented as using unconventional positioning techniques, primarily the head tilt method, survived an average of 8.7 weeks under identical tactical conditions. The statistical significance was undeniable. The technique increased survival probability by a factor of approximately 2.7. In military terms, that multiplier represented thousands of soldiers who lived instead of dying, thousands of additional German casualties inflicted, and measurable improvements in combat effectiveness across entire rifle divisions. The main artillery directorate faced an institutional crisis. Acknowledging the technique's effectiveness meant admitting their doctrine had been inadequate. It meant validating field adaptations developed by sergeants rather than staff officers. It meant incorporating methods that violated principles their instructors had taught for decades. But the alternative was continuing to send snipers into combat with training that demonstrably got them killed at preventable rates. The compromise emerged in May 1943 through a classified directive that modified sniper training without officially repudiating previous doctrine. The new guidance described the head tilt technique as an advanced method for experienced marksmen operating in high-threat counter-sniper environments. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't presented as superior to conventional form. It was simply acknowledged as a legitimate tactical option that commanders could authorize when circumstances warranted. The bureaucratic hedging fooled nobody who'd actually fought in Stalingrad. But it allowed the institution to adapt without admitting error, and pragmatic soldiers cared more about results than pride. Sniper schools began incorporating tilted shooting positions into their curriculum, teaching students both conventional and unconventional methods. The resistance from traditional marksmanship instructors was fierce and predictable. Senior sergeants who'd spent their entire careers perfecting proper form viewed the technique as corruption of fundamental skills. They argued that teaching new snipers to violate basic principles would produce sloppy marksmen who couldn't hit targets reliably. Their concerns had merit. The head tilt technique did reduce theoretical accuracy. Students who learned unconventional positioning before mastering conventional form often developed bad habits that degraded their overall effectiveness. The solution implemented by forward-thinking instructors involved sequential training. Students first achieved proficiency in standard marksmanship, demonstrating consistent accuracy from proper positions. Only after mastering fundamentals did they learn tilted shooting as an advanced technique for specific tactical situations. This approach preserved core skills while adding tactical flexibility, but it required longer training cycles, more ammunition for practice, and instructors willing to teach methods they personally disagreed with. The resource constraints of the Soviet war effort in 1943 made comprehensive implementation impossible. Some schools taught the technique thoroughly, others gave it cursory coverage. Many instructors simply ignored the directive and continued teaching traditional methods exclusively. The result was inconsistent preparation across the Red Army's sniper force. Soldiers deployed to frontline units arrived with wildly different skill sets depending on which school they'd attended and which instructors they'd trained under. Zaitsev himself was pulled from frontline service in May 1943 to serve as a sniper instructor. The reassignment took him from combat operations, where his skills were immediately valuable, to training duties, where his influence could potentially affect hundreds of future snipers. The decision reflected Soviet military logic at its most pragmatic. One exceptional sniper might kill 200 enemy soldiers personally. But that same sniper training, 500 students who each survived long enough to kill 50 enemies, represented a force multiplier that dwarfed individual effectiveness. His instruction methods emphasized practical application over theoretical understanding. He demonstrated tilted shooting positions in field conditions, showing students exactly how to count their heads, how much optical distortion to expect, and how to compensate for the introduced error. He explained the tactical rationale through stories of specific engagements where the technique had saved his life or enabled kills that conventional positioning would have prevented. He critiqued students during live fire exercises, correcting their form until the unconventional positions became as natural as proper marksmanship. The feedback from students trained by Zaitsev was remarkably consistent. The technique felt wrong initially. Every instinct developed during basic marksmanship. Training screamed that tilting your head ruined accuracy. But after sufficient practice, the method became intuitive. Students learned to recognize tactical situations where tilted positioning provided advantages. They developed the judgment to switch between conventional and unconventional form based on threat assessment. Most importantly, they internalized that survival mattered more than textbook perfection. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Zaitsev trained approximately 400 snipers during his stint as an instructor between May and December 1943. Tracking their subsequent combat performance revealed data that validated the technique's effectiveness beyond Stalingrad's specific circumstances. These snipers deployed to various fronts across the Eastern Theater: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, each with different terrain and tactical lies and conditions than Stalingrad's urban environment. Yet the survival advantage persisted. Zaitsev-trained snipers consistently outlived their peers and achieved higher kill counts across all deployment locations. The correlation suggested the head tilt technique's benefits extended beyond counter-sniper duels in city ruins. The underlying principle, breaking up recognizable silhouettes to degrade enemy target identification, applied to any situation where opposing marksmen hunted each other. Forest combat, steppe warfare, mountain operations all featured counter-sniper engagements where unconventional positioning provided measurable advantages. By late 1943, German intelligence had compiled enough information about Soviet sniper tactics to recognize a systematic change in their approach. Wehrmacht after-action reports noted increasing difficulty identifying Soviet marksmen in forward positions. They documented longer engagement times during counter-sniper operations. They recorded higher casualties among German snipers during encounters with Soviet marksmen. The pattern was clear enough that German sniper training incorporated specific modules on identifying asymmetrically positioned shooters, but recognition training could only partially compensate for the technique's effectiveness. The fundamental problem remained that tilted positioning created visual ambiguity that degraded target identification, regardless of how thoroughly observers were trained. German snipers could learn to spot unconventional positions, but doing so required more time, more careful observation, and better concealment discipline than identifying conventional silhouettes. Those additional requirements slowed their engagement cycle and reduced their overall effectiveness. The tactical advantage had shifted measurably towards Soviet snipers. The shift manifested in casualty statistics by early 1944. German sniper kill ratios, the number of enemy soldiers killed per sniper lost, had declined from approximately 8-1 in 1941 to roughly 4-1 by late 1943. Soviet ratios had improved from approximately 2-1 to nearly 5-1 over the same period. Multiple factors contributed to these changes. Improved Soviet training, better equipment, numerical superiority, and deteriorating German tactical positions all played roles. But the adoption of unconventional shooting techniques represented one measurable component of Soviet improvement. The head tilt method wasn't winning the war by itself. It was one tactical innovation among hundreds that collectively shifted effectiveness towards Soviet forces as the war progressed. Zaitsev returned to frontline service in January 1944, deployed to the First Ukrainian Front during operations to liberate western Ukraine from German occupation. His role had evolved beyond individual sniper operations. He now commanded sniper detachments, coordinating multiple marksmen in support of infantry advances. The tactical employment of snipers in offensive operations differed substantially from defensive urban warfare. Rather than occupying static positions for extended periods, snipers moved with advancing forces, engaging targets of opportunity while protecting infantry from German defensive positions. The head tilt technique remained relevant but required adaptation. Quick shots from hasty positions demanded faster setup than deliberate engagements from prepared hides. Zaitsev and his detachment developed modified techniques for rapid tilted shooting, reduced cant angles that introduced less distortion but still broke up recognizable silhouettes, simplified compensation methods that worked adequately without requiring careful adjustment, training shortcuts that let infantry snipers employ the technique effectively without the extensive practice that specialized marksmen received. These modifications represented practical adaptation to operational realities. The perfect was the enemy of the good. A technique that worked adequately for most snipers most of the time was more valuable than an optimal method that only specialists could employ effectively. The simplified versions of tilted shooting spread through Soviet rifle divisions during 1944 offensive operations. Adoption rates varied by unit, commander preferences, and the presence of experienced snipers who could teach the technique. But by mid-1944, unconventional positioning had become common enough that German forces simply assumed Soviet snipers would employ asymmetric silhouettes. That assumption itself represented a tactical victory. When your enemy expects unconventional behavior, conventional positioning becomes unexpectedly effective. Snipers who could switch between standard and tilted shooting based on circumstances gained unpredictability, advantages that enhanced their survivability. The cat-and-mouse dynamic of counter-sniper warfare had evolved into a complex game where neither side could rely on assumptions about opponent behavior. Zaitsev's combat operations during 1944 and 1945 added another 73 confirmed kills to his total, bringing his final count to 298. The number placed him among the most successful snipers in Soviet service, though other marksmen achieved higher totals. Mikhail Surkov recorded 402 confirmed kills. Ivan Sidorenko claimed 500. Fyodor Oklopkov was credited with 429. The variation in kill counts reflected different deployment circumstances, varying record-keeping practices, and inconsistent confirmation standards rather than pure skill differences. What distinguished Zaitsev from higher-scoring peers was his documented influence on Soviet sniper doctrine. His role in propagating the head tilt technique, his service as an instructor, and his advocacy for tactical innovations affected thousands of snipers beyond his personal combat record. The force multiplier effect of that influence arguably produced more German casualties than his individual marksmanship, though quantifying such effects precisely is impossible. The German army's attempts to counter tilted shooting techniques revealed the limitations of reactive adaptation. By the time they'd incorporated asymmetric position recognition into training programs, Soviet snipers had moved on to additional innovations. Decoy positions, coordinated fires, mobile sniping from moving vehicles. Each new technique forced German countermeasures that arrived too late to affect tactical outcomes. The Wehrmacht was fighting the previous engagement, while Soviet snipers evolved their methods continuously. This innovation cycle illustrated broader patterns in the Eastern Front's evolution. German forces began the war with superior training, better equipment, and more effective doctrine. But the Soviet military's willingness to adapt, its acceptance of casualties during the learning process, and its ability to scale successful innovations across enormous formations eventually overwhelmed German tactical advantages. The head tilt shooting technique was a microcosm of that larger dynamic, a simple innovation that violated established doctrine but addressed real tactical problems, propagated through informal networks before official acceptance, refined through continuous battlefield application, and ultimately adopted widely enough to affect strategic outcomes. The technique's post-war legacy extended beyond the Soviet military. When Western intelligence services debriefed German prisoners who'd fought on the Eastern Front, they collected information about Soviet sniper tactics, including unconventional positioning methods. American and British sniper training programs examined these techniques, testing whether they provided advantages in different tactical contexts. The American and British sniper training programs, to our conclusions, were nuanced. The head tilt method's effectiveness depended heavily on specific circumstances. Urban warfare against enemy snipers actively hunting your position, the technique offered clear benefits. Open terrain engagement at extended ranges, conventional positioning provided better accuracy without meaningful silhouette advantages. The key insight wasn't that tilted shooting was universally superior. It was that tactical flexibility and willingness to violate doctrine when circumstances warranted could provide significant advantages over rigid adherence to standard procedures. That lesson influenced Western military training across multiple domains beyond sniping. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, provided the first major test of whether techniques developed on the Eastern Front would transfer to different conflicts. United Nations forces employed snipers extensively, and many faced Chinese and North Korean marksmen trained in Soviet methods. Reports from Korea confirmed that communist snipers frequently used unconventional positioning that complicated counter-sniper operations. American snipers who adapted their techniques to counter asymmetric silhouettes performed better than those who relied exclusively on standard doctrine. The validation of Eastern Front innovations in a completely different war suggested the underlying principles had broad applicability. Vietnam would later provide additional confirmation. American snipers facing Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army marksmen encountered similar challenges. Enemy snipers who broke up recognizable silhouettes through unconventional positioning proved significantly harder to identify and engage. The lessons learned in Stalingrad remained relevant 25 years later in Southeast Asian jungles. Modern military sniper training incorporates elements derived from techniques developed during World War II urban combat. The specific head tilt method has been refined and modified, but the underlying principle of using unconventional positioning to degrade enemy target recognition remains standard curriculum. Students learn both proper marksmanship fundamentals and tactical variations that sacrifice some theoretical accuracy for improved survivability. The balance between perfection and practicality that Zaitsev navigated in 1942 remains central to sniper training today. Zaitsev himself survived the war, one of relatively few Soviet snipers who lived through the entire conflict. He was seriously wounded in January 1943 when a mortar round detonated near his position, causing severe eye damage that ended his frontline service temporarily. The injury was ironic given that he'd spent years protecting his head through careful positioning and tactical innovation. Artillery didn't care about silhouettes or shooting techniques. Random explosions killed indiscriminately, which was precisely why snipers preferred precision over saturation fire. After recovering, Zaitsev served in training and command roles rather than returning to active sniping. His value as an instructor and his experience coordinating sniper operations made him more useful in organizational capacities than as an individual marksman. He emerged from the war as a highly decorated officer, awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. His post-war life was comparatively quiet. He worked as a factory director in Kiev, far from the combat zones where he'd made his reputation. He wrote a memoir, Notes of a Sniper, published in 1956, which detailed his experiences in Stalingrad and his development of sniper tactics. The book became required reading in Soviet military schools and influenced generations of marksmen. But Zaitsev never claimed to have single-handedly revolutionized sniper warfare. His memoir emphasized learning from other soldiers, adapting to circumstances, and recognizing that survival required flexibility rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. The head tilt technique received only brief mention, described as one adaptation among many that helped snipers survive Stalingrad's brutal conditions. Western historians later elevated the technique's significance, recognizing it as a documented tactical innovation with measurable effectiveness. Soviet military histories tended to downplay individual innovations in favor of collective narratives about the Red Army's victory. The tension between these interpretations reflects different cultural approaches to military history rather than disagreements about facts. What remains undisputed is that Soviet snipers in 1942 faced a tactical problem where German counter-sniper effectiveness threatened their survival. A technique emerged that addressed that problem through unconventional positioning. The technique spread through informal networks and eventually received official recognition. Snipers using the method survived at significantly higher rates than those using conventional form, and the innovation influenced sniper doctrine in multiple militaries for decades afterward. These facts establish the head tilt technique's historical importance regardless of how different national narratives frame the story. The broader lesson of Zaitsev's experience concerns how military organizations learn and adapt. Doctrine exists to provide standardized frameworks that work across varied circumstances, but doctrine becomes dogma when it prevents adaptation to novel situations. The tension between maintaining standards and encouraging innovation defines effective military institutions. Organizations that lean too heavily toward standardization become brittle, unable to respond when opponents develop unexpected capabilities. Organizations that embrace innovation too readily lose the consistency that enables large-scale coordination. The optimal balance varies by circumstance, but completely rigid doctrine is always suboptimal in warfare, where opponents continuously adapt. Zaitsev's story illustrates one soldier's navigation of that tension. He learned conventional marksmanship, mastered it sufficiently to recognize its limitations, adapted when circumstances demanded innovation, and taught others to think flexibly rather than follow rules blindly. That progression from competence through adaptation to instruction represents the ideal development arc for military professionals. It's also rare enough that Zaitsev's example remains noteworthy 8 decades later. The technique's effectiveness depended partly on specific tactical circumstances and partly on the human psychology of pattern recognition. German snipers, trained to identify specific visual signatures, became less effective when those signatures changed. Their training created cognitive frameworks that worked brilliantly against conventional opponents but struggled with unconventional presentations. This vulnerability affected more than just sniper operations. Infantry trained to recognize specific enemy formations became confused when opponents used unfamiliar tactics. Artillery observers expecting standard target behaviors struggled when presented with unexpected patterns. The same cognitive efficiency that enabled rapid decision-making in familiar situations became a liability when facing novel circumstances. Modern military training attempts to address this vulnerability through exposure to varied scenarios and explicit instruction on avoiding cognitive rigidity. But the fundamental tension remains. Human brains excel at pattern recognition, which enables rapid responses to familiar situations. That same capability creates exploitable vulnerabilities when opponents deliberately break expected patterns. Zaitsev's innovation worked because it exploited German reliance on standard pattern recognition. The technique would have been less effective against opponents with no preconceptions about how snipers should position themselves. Context matters enormously in evaluating tactical innovations. The statistical analysis of the technique's effectiveness relies on casualty data that Soviet record-keeping captured inconsistently. Confirmed kill counts depended on verification procedures that varied by unit and time frame. Survival statistics reflected reported casualties, which might not include soldiers listed as missing who actually died. Attribution of survival advantages specifically to tilted shooting rather than other confounding factors requires assumptions about baseline comparison groups that may not have been truly equivalent. These methodological limitations mean the quantified effectiveness claims should be interpreted cautiously. The technique clearly provided some advantage, but whether that advantage was precisely 2.7 times or some other multiple remains uncertain within relatively wide confidence intervals. What can be stated definitively is that Soviet snipers perceived the technique as valuable. German snipers reported increased difficulty identifying Soviet positions, and casualty patterns shifted in ways consistent with improved Soviet counter-sniper effectiveness during the period when tilted shooting was adopted. Those observations support the conclusion that the innovation provided meaningful tactical benefits, even if precise quantification remains elusive. The head tilt technique's development also illustrated how tactical innovations often emerge from necessity rather than systematic research. Zaitsev didn't derive the method through ballistic calculations or optical physics. He observed that German snipers were killing Soviet marksmen by identifying their shooting silhouettes. He needed to break up that silhouette. Tilting his head was the simplest solution available. The theoretical explanation for why the technique worked came later, after its practical effectiveness had been demonstrated. This sequence, practical adaptation, preceding theoretical understanding, characterizes many battlefield innovations. Soldiers facing immediate threats improvise solutions using available resources. If the improvisation works, it gets refined and shared. Eventually, someone analyzes why it worked and develops theoretical frameworks. But the theory follows practice rather than guiding it. Academic military analysts sometimes critique this approach as inefficient. Surely systematic research into optimal tactics would produce better solutions faster than random field experimentation. The critique has merit in peacetime when consequences of failed experiments are limited. But combat environments punish failed experiments with death, which creates powerful selection pressure toward solutions that work regardless of whether they're theoretically optimal. Zaitsev's technique succeeded because it solved a real problem adequately, not because it represented the theoretically perfect solution. Better solutions might have existed, but discovering them would have required experiments that got soldiers killed. The simple expedient of tilting your head worked well enough to keep people alive, which made it the practical optimum even if theoretical analysis suggested improvements. The distinction between theoretical optimality and practical effectiveness appears throughout military history. Weapons that should theoretically dominate prove less effective in actual combat due to reliability issues, logistical constraints, or operator limitations. Tactics that appear brilliant on planning maps fail when executed by exhausted soldiers in chaotic conditions. Systems that work perfectly in controlled tests break down when subjected to the stress and uncertainty of real warfare. Combat effectiveness depends more on robust adequacy than theoretical perfection. The head tilt technique embodied that principle. It wasn't perfect. It introduced accuracy problems that proper form avoided, but it kept snipers alive long enough to employ their imperfect accuracy, which made it more effective than perfect shooting positions that got you killed before you could fire. Zaitsev died in 1991, shortly after the Soviet Union's collapse. He was 76 years old and had lived to see the political system he'd fought for dissolve. Whether he viewed that outcome as validating or negating his wartime sacrifices is unknown. His memoir and interviews focused on military tactics and personal experiences rather than political commentary. He presented himself as a soldier who'd done his duty during a desperate war, not as an ideological warrior fighting for communism's triumph. That framing allowed his tactical innovations to be evaluated independently of Soviet political narratives. Western military analysts could study his techniques without endorsing the system he served. The separation between tactical lessons and political context enabled broader dissemination of innovations that might otherwise have been dismissed due to Cold War antagonisms. The head tilt technique's influence on modern sniper doctrine remains visible in current training programs. Students learn to vary their shooting positions, avoiding predictable silhouettes that enemy counter-sniper teams might recognize. They practice engaging targets from unconventional angles and positions. They're taught that survival in counter-sniper environments requires breaking patterns and avoiding behaviors that enemy training would lead them to expect. These principles trace directly to innovations developed in Stalingrad's ruins 80 years ago. The specific head cant angles and compensation methods have been refined through decades of additional experience. Modern optics and rifles perform differently than World War II equipment, requiring adjustments to technique. But the underlying concept that unconventional positioning can provide tactical advantages against pattern recognition-dependent opponents remains valid. Zaitsev's legacy extends beyond the specific technique to the broader lesson about tactical adaptation. Military effectiveness requires balancing doctrinal consistency with situational flexibility. Soldiers need foundational skills that work across varied circumstances, but they also need permission and training to deviate from standard procedures when tactical situations demand innovation. Organizations that successfully navigate this balance produce forces capable of both coordinated operations and creative adaptation. Those that fail produce either well-coordinated incompetence or individual effectiveness without collective purpose. The head tilt shooting technique represents one soldier's successful navigation of that balance. Zaitsev learned proper marksmanship, recognized its limitations in specific circumstances, developed an adaptation that violated doctrine but addressed real problems, taught others to think flexibly, and eventually influenced official doctrine to incorporate tactical innovations. That progression from student through innovator to instructor exemplifies effective military professionalism. It also remains sufficiently rare that his example deserves continued study. The technique's effectiveness in multiple conflicts across decades suggests it addressed something fundamental about counter-sniper warfare rather than exploiting temporary German vulnerabilities. The underlying principle that breaking expected patterns degrades opponent effectiveness applies broadly across military operations. Zaitsev happened to discover one specific application of that principle, but the lesson extends to formations, timing, movement patterns, communication protocols, and countless other domains where opponents use pattern recognition to predict and counter your actions. Understanding that broader principle matters more than memorizing the specific head tilt technique. Students studying Zaitsev's innovation should focus less on the mechanical details of how much to count their heads, and more on the thought process that led him to question standard doctrine, experiment with alternatives, and advocate for changes despite institutional resistance. That mindset of critical evaluation and pragmatic adaptation remains the technique's most valuable legacy. On October 3, 1941, a Soviet sergeant with 43 confirmed kills pressed his cheek against a Mosin Nagant rifle stock in the ruins of Stalingrad and made a decision that violated everything he'd been taught about marksmanship. He tilted his head 20 degrees to the left, breaking up his shooting silhouette in a way that should have ruined his accuracy but instead saved his life. That simple expedient, refined and taught to hundreds of other snipers, measurably improved Soviet counter-sniper effectiveness at a critical point in the war's most brutal urban battle. The technique didn't win the war. It was one small innovation among thousands that collectively shifted tactical effectiveness towards Soviet forces. But it kept soldiers alive who would otherwise have died. It killed German soldiers who might otherwise have survived. And it demonstrated that sometimes the greatest tactical advantages come not from following doctrine, but from having the judgment to recognize when doctrine serves you poorly and the courage to do something different. Vasily Zaitsev understood that lesson. The 298 German soldiers who died in his rifle sights proved he'd learned it well. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.